Parsons got me on the moon. Jack Parsons got me on the moon. Well, good evening everybody, back on Sunday night again, but we're not on Hocus Focus exclusively this week. Because Sarah is away with family commitments, I shall be using the opportunity to kind of doing a VON, which will be a kind of a VON Hocus Focus mashup. Now, as you can see, the background is different. This is a room here in my place. You can see Billy in the background there, and he's chilling out on the chair. And I'm sitting on this side of the screen because on this side of the screen I shall be putting up pictures to illustrate the subjects I'm talking about. Now, I hope you're all keeping well and everybody's happy and contented and you're enjoying your Sunday evening. So we'll try to make this something a little bit special here on Beyond Room 313 channel. And in preparation for this, I was just going to, do my usual yapping, whatever, freestyle talk. But I said I'd try something different, and what I did was I put a bunch of requests on my Facebook page asking people what subjects I have never spoken about or things that you'd like me to speak about or for further clarify upon. Got loads and loads of good suggestions. Some of them I've already covered them over the years. I don't really want to talk about them again. Others, maybe time to revisit them. It's a lifelong process and learning kind of thing, so sometimes you do change your opinions on things. And that's part of, I think growing in a spiritual sense is the ability to adapt and to change. Now, when I say spiritual, I don't mean a religious sense. I mean the spiritual psychic foundation of the self. You kind of, when you approach subjects like the Marina Abramovich stuff, and what's happening there is, You don't have to like it. You can love it if you want. Some people I've opened up a whole new vista for them with the Marina Abramovich thing, and they're fascinated now, just like it happened to me. But as a Jungian myself, this is part of integrating the shadow, and this is why New Ages go all insane, because everything is airy fairy and love and light, and there's nothing challenging to the worldview they live in. So that was, those of you who've watched that stuff without having a visceral reaction and just said, watched and said, it's rubbish, it's interesting, some of it's rubbish, some of it's great, I really enjoyed it, it's opened up a new vista to me. what you've done by just indulging that segment of Hocus Pocus 2 weeks ago, and a little bit I'll be talking about tonight, is you're integrating your shadow. Because you're confronting knowledge that you're adverse to. And your reaction to it, once it's not visceral, but is based on contemplation, is a valid response. The pitchforks is not a valid response, neither is wanting it to like it to be cool, like so many Hollywood flakes, is not a, like Lady Gaga and people like that, is not a valid response. A valid response is you looked at it and you had a specific reaction, one way or the other, or neutral, and that's it. And you because you've looked at this, and if you were adverse to the information beforehand, but then dived into it, you've integrated your shadow. I remember years ago when I first wrote the book Puzzling People, there were people who were said to me, I'm not reading that book because it deals with darkness. And these lollies were new age types, you know. I mean, cupcake, if that's how you want to live, that's okay. But I guarantee you, when you go for a walk out on the beach and you're watching a beautiful sunset, or you're sitting on the grass, there are millions of creatures tearing each other asunder, right below your feet, right below your picnic towel, right below your picnic basket. This is the laws of the universe, at least on this planet anyway. But it's all part of the exchange of energy. So to say you don't want to confront anything negative that may mature or grow you as a person, add to your psychic integration, is a very unhealthy road to go down. In fact, someone asked me to talk about soul loss, and I will do later in the broadcast, because that's part of this whole thing of love and light and not integrating your shadow, and this whole concept that you should kill your ego, that often leads to soul loss. This is why new age people are extremely dangerous. I have the list of the topics I am going to talk about here. I have in front of me that you requested. I'm not going to tell your name because but you know who you are anyway, but thanks anyway. So the first question is, Thomas, tell us about your own history and how you were introduced to magic and the occult. Well, I think I've mentioned it kind of casually a few times in the past, but yeah, it was a very specific thing. But looking back on it, like everything else in life, whether you take up a musical instrument or whether you decide to move to a different country, there is a sort of a trajectory that happens prior to it, a kind of like about personal foreshadowing that brings you to the place where you cross that threshold and into these new experiences. Now, I was frighteningly young when I think about it, probably 9, 10, when I started on this path, and it first began with me with an interest in astronomy of all things. And I got a telescope for my birthday, and I was absolutely enchanted by the thing. And literally a psychedelic experience, looking through this 2-inch refractor at the moon, at the moons of Jupiter, or even just looking at ships out in the Irish Sea where we could see them from where we lived. It was just magical. I can still feel the sensation of seeing the focus as powerful as what it was. And even you still got a fair bit of distance on a 2-inch refractor, which is a fairly good telescope back then. But they're much cheaper now and they're easier to get. I remember I bought it my parents bought it for me in Hamilton Long, which was a chemist at the top, a chemist that also sold telescopes believe it or not. Well, they sold binoculars and optical equipment as part of their kind of like opticians range, but they had a fantastic display of telescopes and binoculars and that kind of thing in the window. And my parents could only afford the cheapest one, which is 2-inch refractor. But it's interesting that shop is mentioned in Ulysses as Hamilton's long syringe, as a euphemism for an erect penis. So anyway, why I said that I just don't know. It's like the chap Nick said on Saturday Morning Seance in one of his reports. you know, hauntology is just outside your front door. It's on the streets you walk in. You don't have to travel necessarily on a pilgrimage to Tibet to find the magical. And that's absolutely true. It's like what Franz Kafka said: silently sit in your room and the world will unfold at your feet eventually. Now, so I was fascinated. I was looking at these things in the sky, and I had kind of a rough idea what one thing was or another. Started to learn the constellations and everything like that, and paying great attention to the sky, and seeing things that I thought might have been UFOs and aliens. Well, back then, I didn't even believe the aliens. Well, actually, I probably did, but it all tied in with that. You know, it wasn't just like an exploration in the science of astronomy, but also in things like that too. Like there'd be a strange light in the sky that I couldn't explain back then, and it would set me off on a sense of wonder. And then you'd pick up Eric Van Daniken's book, like, you know, Chariot of the Gods, and then you'd go to Flying Saucer Real, these kinds of book, Adamski's books. And like I said, I was very young. I was like 9, 10. And so the interest in astronomy led to me getting a book. We had a good library in Ballymun, neighbourhood library, and they had a good range of books back then. Often the poorer neighbourhoods got books that were hand-me-downs from the more middle-class neighbourhoods, because they thought we were all stupid. But often, or we didn't deserve the latest expensive books, so they would often send us books that were well worn from the Drumcondra Library or from the Whitehall Library or from the, you know, somewhere else, somewhere a middle-class area. And one of the books was an old astronomy book, and I wish I could have it. I wish I could find it to this day. It was about that size, the book, and it had basically the night sky on each page, beautifully rendered in a circle of deep blue with the stars on it, indicated in kind of like, you know, the way old engineering drawings were done in black, and they would write on it with a white marker. Though they were written down like that, so it was but it was beautiful. And then one side of the book told you, say, Cassiopeia will be it'll be north, south, east, west. So Cassiopeia is in the east, whatever, this time of year. Ursa Major, Argo, Draco, this kind of thing. And next to it would be a little kind of synopsis on who Pegasus was, who Andromeda was, and it's opened up a whole incredible world for me. Suddenly we had these things are named after Greek and Roman gods. You know, I didn't know that. And the planets are too, and they move independently. So it was, and again, I knew nothing about astrology other than I used to see these things in the paper, but I knew it was a Libra, but I knew nothing about astrology. But I instinctively was aware that my interest in astronomy and the effect of the telescope and going out at night under the stars, you know, where it could be pitch black. A thing myself and Sarah will write about in our upcoming book is the power cutouts, the blackouts during the 1970s. In England it was because of strikes, in Ireland it was because of the Arab oil embargo, and they used to shut off the lights in the cities at like 8 o'clock in the evening. Now, if you were into the night sky, it was like the ultimate show in front of you, and that was also a very almost psychedelic experience. So you have these experiences. I had this sense. For the first time in my life, I had what I was called a spiritual experience. I was also getting that among nature too as well. There was a forest near north of Ballymun called Massey's Forest or Massey's Woods. No, that's in Wicklow. That was there too. No, called Trinity Forest or Trinity Woods, and it was an old estate, Santry Dempsey, and there was a river ran through it called the Slade River, and the river was all in the deep woods of an old growth forest, and it was just a magical thing being there. And there was an island in the middle of the river, and how it was accessed was that two trees had fallen and collapsed like this and made a natural bridge. And I was having those same kind of experiences, feelings, sensations inside me that I was also getting from the night sky. And this was before, decades before I knew what NPCs were. And I just thought that other people had these feelings and sensations in them. I thought it was normal human behaviour. But it was eventually to find that, most people are dead inside and don't have these experiences and feelings. And fate would have it that there was a chain of second-hand bookshops around Ireland, around Dublin mainly. I don't know if they're in other towns, but mostly the north side of Dublin, most of them, called the Bamba. Now, Bamba is an old name, a very ancient name for Ireland. There was Bamba, Folva, and Eru. But Bamba was probably the oldest name for Ireland. That was the original, probably before the Celtic people came along, the name of the island was probably Bamba. And so the Bamba bookshops specialised in second-hand paperbacks, which people in Dublin back then read in their millions. I mean, it was quite remarkable how much reading was done in that city by the average person. And so you could pick up, second-hand books for nothing, and really good stuff. So that's when I stumbled upon Dennis Wheatley, and this is before I even made the connection between the Hammer films, because that was a bit later for me, and his books. And one of the first books I'd read was The Devil Rides Out, I think, and it was a very I had this experience with Lovecraft when I was older. I would read the book with a flashlight underneath. You'd be under the covers with a flashlight, right? And you'd be reading the book, and everything around you is dark, and you would have this fixity of concentration upon the text and the story. And that's what it was like for me. And he kept talking about things called grimoires and books of the occult and magic rituals and all these other kinds of things, right? So in the centre of Dublin on O'Connell Street was a huge bookstore called Eason's. It's still there, but like all the great bookstores today, it makes its money in other ways from selling everything else, but only a few handful of books. But it was like 4 floors of books, and they had what they called an alternative spirituality section. And in there I found a book called Magic, a Primer by a Welsh writer called David Conway. And I bought the book and took it home. And it had everything about talismans and seals and magic rituals, but it was heavily focused on the Kabbalah, which is the first time I'd ever learned about that stuff. And the book was not like the version now with the kind of boring green cover. It had like a really interesting cover that was mostly black with magic written in a kind of a scrawly font, a scrawly sans serif font. And it had an index in the back, which a new version doesn't have. So at the time I was in school, there was a bully that was bullying me, and I decided to hex him, and it worked. A couple of days after I did it, he'd broken both of his legs and couldn't return back to school, and had to go to some kind of place that was like a remedial clinic to fix his legs. And rather than me going, I was absolutely terrified. I was absolutely terrified that I'd done some kind of pact with the dark world, which I suppose I did, and sort of put the book away then after that, and just went back into my regular sort of occultic interest for a few years of Dennis Wheatley. Then later on I learned about Lovecraft, and then things like I took an interest in dystopian sci-fi. I remember I still got my original copy of the Midwich Cuckoos, and many other things. And so I was kind of done with the occult because I got a fright that I did something bad, which I suppose I did. Okay, but he was a little animal. This kid. He was absolutely disgusting. The things he did to me, including sexual assault, I might add. But it frightened me. It frightened me. So that was that. Then later on, I through the bamba again, and I'd already been through the kind of punk rock scene, and started learning how to play guitar, and took an interest in things. And it was the Corgi print, this is about 76, 77, of the Necronomicon, the Book of Dead Names, with the foreword by Colin Wilson. Now this book is kind of a satire. It's kind of a satire, okay? But it contains a fabulous foreword by Colin Wilson that's not a satire, and also magical experiences that have happened to him. And this is before I knew he had written books on the occult, really. That was laid down the road, called Beyond the Occult and so on. And it also contained stuff about chaos magic, which was evolving a thing then. But there was also rituals in there for the summoning of the great Cthulhu. And I started, and it painted this imagery of Arkham and Innsmouth, Cthulhu, and the Lovecraftian mythos as a real thing. So this began another magical experiential journey for me, and that somehow there was a reality to fiction, and it had to be, because it was because of Dennis Weasley's fiction that I'd stumbled upon David Conway's book. I did a magic ritual in it which worked, and then it frightened me, which is also part of the kind of adept's process, because I was all on my own doing this. I had no one help me. I had friends I spoke to about it, and they were kind of like, well, that kind of sounds interesting, but never really went anywhere. And then understanding that maybe fictional stories are not so much fictional after all. And it's very easy for me to sit here now saying it happened like that, but it didn't happen like that. It was a long, slow, gradual process. And I can honestly say, growing up in what I call a deep town, the Ballymun Flats, and you've seen pictures that I posted of what it was like there when I was growing up, a bleak concrete landscape of 1960s dystopian French Marxist brutalism, that actually helped. That actually helped me. It actually, because I think the landscape was bleak. The landscape was bleak. You looked for colour. Psychologically, you looked for colour. So because there was nothing around me of anything other than boxes that people survived in, you searched for something further, and I realized at a very early age, and again, when I say consciously, I mean just barely consciously, well, almost like the subconscious knew, right? But I didn't, and well, I kind of did. It's very difficult to explain that this blank canvas had generated the need for something to transcend it, and that for me was things like music, punk rock, and early heavy metal, new wave of British heavy metal, electronic music, like Cabaret Voltaire, and the first Chew by Army record, and then the soundtracks, and horror films, and and I realized that things like these, watching a movie like Alien or Escape from New York in a grotty cinema, for £1 because you were on the dole and you had a, well, I was unemployed, but I never collected unemployment payment. So I always found a way to get money, working, washing dishes and shit like that, and mopping floors in bars. I didn't feel disadvantaged at all. Now I did feel trapped in Ireland. Not I hated Ireland or anything like that, but Ireland seemed small and the world seemed so big, and I wanted to see it. But I didn't feel trapped in any kind of social or personal ghetto. Everything was an endless vista for me, and there was a pursuit of beauty that got me interested in going to things like the National Art Gallery and looking at paintings and stuff like that, or to the National Museum of Archaeology and looking at ancient stuff, and that was all part of something I was interested in as well. But I would say the decisive moment of when the occult had hit me in a very positive way was there was a place in Dublin called the Dandelion Market. It was on Stephen's Green, but it's buried underneath a shopping centre now. Quite a nice shopping centre, actually, as those places go. And it was a series of catacombs that connected warehouses and storage rooms. It was where all wine cellars and stuff used to be. And somebody in the 1960s, some hippies had the idea of making it into a Camden market, like in London type thing, where all the catacombs were kind of connected through corridors and old walkways and ancient streets that were all, had roofs on them, and with little stores and shops in them, and and it was magical. And I bought like my copy of AC/DC's album of If You Want Blood, You Got It there, and I bought the Shoebites Army, our friend's Electric album there, and that was because I first heard Down in the Park in Gary Newman's voice, and I was amazed that he wasn't much older than me at the time. But anyway, there was these catacombs, and a lot of them sold clothes. They were like mini boutiques that the women had set up, and they were very, very nice. They set up, they sort of like hippie clothes, and then others sold punk rock kind of clothes. But there was odd ones too. There was one that was a little music shop that was great, that sold guitars and drums and stuff like that, and keyboards. And there was this one woman who did tarot readings, and you could see her doing the tarot readings through the window. So you looked inside, and she was doing a tarot reading, and she was quite beautiful. She looked like she was in her late 40s. She had bangles, and she was like really beautiful hair, and really elegant to me. She seemed like very elegant, dressed almost with that gypsy flair kind of thing going on. And so after 2 or 3 visits, I saw her pulling these cards out, and it was people in there, mostly middle-aged women. So I plucked the courage up, and then eventually said, "Can I get a tarot reading?" And she says, "Come back in an hour. I'll have a spot then." And so I came back in an hour, and it was like a £5 or something. And turns out she was French, which only added to the kind of sexiness of the whole thing. And she did this tarot reading for me, and I was using the Tarot de Marseille, a very basic tarot. But the way she shuffled them, and her hands moved, and the way she took the cards out of the deck, and the way she described the significance of each card and what they meant, there was a lot of care in it. You'd have the stereotype that these people who read the tarot were just only interested in telling nymphomaniacs down the seaside that they were going to marry a doctor or something like that. But it wasn't like that at all. She was very considerate and very helpful and very kind. There was a huge amount of kindness there. And so that was it. That was the beginning of sort of like my interest in the occult. But not just that on its own. It was basically, I had an arsenal. I had an arsenal of the magic stuff from the early days, the sort of sense of marvel and wonder that was the beginning of a serious paganism. That's what the stars and the nature thing was, and the megaliths. moved away from Abrahamism as soon as Catholic Church as soon as I was a kid, and as I could, and it seemed all very healthy to me. It seemed all very useful, and it was useful, and that was it. So when people talk about the occult, it's everything. It's an interest in non-human life forms. It's an interest in divination. It's an interest in Jungian psychology. It's an interest in astronomy and astrology together. It's an interest into I was having, when I was in the natural world and then going back to the bleak landscape I lived in, that was hauntology long before hauntology had a description. So I'd say the book that really kicked it off was the Necronomicon, the Book of Dead Names, with the foreword by the Corgi book from '76, I think it is, and that made me think differently about that. The Devil Rides Out fiction, and also an experience I had, which I took loads of time, where I was reading a Lovecraft's anthology paperback again from Famba underneath the covers with the flashlight, and I had a little Philips red transistor radio in my ear with an earpiece in it, the old-fashioned earpieces, run by a 9-volt battery, and tuning around came in an ad from a Buick dealers on Rhode Island, in Providence, Rhode Island, Lovecraft's hometown. I didn't even know what Buick was. Somehow it travelled across the Atlantic and which does happen, and then the wind, I think, even blows the radio signals, or so whatever. It got into my radio for a momentary. That, the tarot reading thing, and then then it's one of those things. If you're not looking for the occult is still interested in you. And every single, like Caroli said, every single act you do is a magic act. You would be better learn to do it properly. And then so even when there was periods where I'd lost interest in magic, and I have to say there wasn't, even when I was in the band, I was very big into conspiracy theory, and that was when I played music back in New York. Conspiracy theory was mainstream among people, like that scene. It wasn't considered a weirdo thing. It was like a historical what if. Conspiracy theory is also part of the occult. It's hidden, the hidden elements of life. So even when I went back and got re-educated again and was working on Wall Street and stuff, I was still heavily interested in the stuff, and I started to learn about etymology and all kinds of things. It never stopped, and coupled with, I think Sarah was the one who said to me that, like, the reason why so many of us, the people like us who refused the prickly pear, if you want to call it that, I have a feeling that the N-word regarding the inoculation, they picked up on the algorithm. So I'm going to call it the prickly pear, and our ability to see through all that stuff was rooted in watching horror films as a kid. Absolutely, 100%. It subconsciously sit within your lower poles of cognition, and it waits there to arise. It becomes unoccultic and comes up into your consciousness. And you think of Dracula, the satanic rites of Dracula. I believe it's Christopher Lee's either last or second last hammer roll as Dracula. And what's it about? A bunch of billionaire industrialists working with a secret government lab to enslave the earth with a virus, and to use it to blackmail governments into what they want to do. And that story manifests again, whether it's the Andromeda strain. I remember the time when the whole thing the event in 2020 kicked off. All the normies were talking about the Stand by Stephen King, but that book, when we read The Stand by Stephen King, really isn't really about anything like that to that same degree. But yeah, things like the Midwich Cuckoos, the Quatermass films, there's just no end to it. And that's why during the Rona Chronicles vlog, I kept saying, I feel like I'm living in a real life Doctor Who episode. So the influences that you had in terms of your pop culture when we were growing up has served us. That's what the book Hocus Focus that myself and Sarah are writing on serves you very, very well later on in life. And so that was my that was my journey into the occult. So the second topic I was asked to speak about, which I've decided to speak about, you know, I'm very interested in Marian apparitions, and I actually will be covering them in the book from my own perspective on them. But there was one I never really spoke about, although it has interested me kind of in the background, and that was the Marian apparitions in Garabandal near Santander in northern Spain, which took place in the early 1960s, 61 I think, where 4 local girls claimed to have visions of the Virgin Mary and were given instructions. Now, what's interesting about this one in particular is that they said something would happen, a miracle would be performed, and this miracle was performed when one of the girls, they claimed they found, without doing it, a piece of communion host was on her tongue. It just magically appeared, allegedly, and she said it was put there by the Archangel Michael. Now, with all these things, you have to really put your Fortean investigative, hat on and look at it from all the aspects, including, the rational point of view. So, it was not unknown for poor peasant girls in poor parts of Italy, Sicily, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Southern Ireland, in peasant kind of communities, France, to pretend they'd seen the Virgin Mary, and a kind of a phobia, and a hysteria I should say, would build up around this. And this hysteria was sometimes generated by the parents, who would actually get, love the attention, saying, my daughter's talking to the Virgin, talking to the Madonna, the Immaculate Conception, and all this stuff. Now, what's interesting about the other Marian apparitions that happened, that were very famous ones, with the exception of St. Bernadette at Lourdes, you have Medjugorje in Bosnia, you have Fatima in Portugal, and you have, there's another one, well, that's two I think of now. They take place in places that used to be Islamic, and there are also places where there were caves, and these cave systems were not in the time of the Iberian Caliphate in Fatima and the Ottoman Empire in Bosnia as the domain of the jinn. And when you read the details, particularly of the Fatima apparition, it's a jinn. Now, Fatima has a tremendous lock on people. In the lots of Muslims but go to Lourdes because go to Fatima, because Shiite Muslims, I think they are, not Sunnis, because they believe that it's a sacred place in Islam, and particularly among Iranian Muslims, while Hindus go to Fatima because they consider Catholicism a pagan religion with all the saints. They see it the same as, which it's true, it's like there's a lot of truth to that, as Hinduism with all the gods and goddesses. They see Catholicism the same way. But this one in Santander is different, because it's kind of interesting in that, forget the miracle, they predicted that John Paul II would be the last real pope. And there seems to be, you look at that thing, there's a lot of truth to that. He was followed by Ratzinger, who basically stepped down from the papacy, in accordance, if we're to believe it, with Saint Malachi's prophecies. And the Pope that followed him, the guy we have now, Francis, is not really a Pope. He's a Jesuit. He's not from the traditional Popey world. And he's the first South American Pope, Latin American Pope. And he's a dyed-in-the-wool globalist. Here's the guy who said if you didn't take the prickly pear, you wouldn't get into heaven, or something to that degree. And that's what makes the Marian apparition at Garabandal so interesting to me, is because the prophecy that was made regarding Pope John Paul II being the final Pope. Now remember, this is 40 odd years before he became Pope. Well, it came true. It came true. And if you think of Ratzkinder's, resignation and then the Jesuits taking over the Holy See, there's truth to that. And the 4 women, I think 2 of them are still alive, they're adults now, 4 girls, are still very, very much devoted and devout Catholics. So they haven't, just ever said it never happened, or we made it up, or our parents forced us into it. They were, to this day, they seem to be very, like, it happened, and that's the end of it. And they're still heavily involved in church matters. The Catholic Church, interestingly enough, and I think it's because of that prophecy regarding John Paul II being the final Pope, I think that is why they've never taken the Marian apparitions, the Lady of Garabandal, seriously. For that reason. I think that they didn't like what those kids had to say. Now, they could have seen the jinn, they could have seen a demon. Don't necessarily believe that they saw the Virgin Mary. And, they definitely that they seemed to have a supernatural experience. There's no doubt about that. And these women never faulted from the story or never denied it. The skeptics have even had a hard time. Now, you could say the one with the miracle with the communion wafer appearing in the girl's mouth, well, that could have been easily stored somewhere. And then she got at the last minute she put it into her mouth, or she had it somewhere. It wasn't a real communion wafer, it was white plastic or something, because it would dissolve. Those things dissolve instantly. So you could say that, fair enough, no problem there. I'd probably go with that as well. You could say the parents bullied them into it, but these parents in this case didn't seem to want anything from this, and were more concerned about the welfare of their children. That. Then there's some other ridiculous theories that one guy said it was because of Spanish Catholics being kind of like anxious or nervous about the upcoming changes to the catechism and the doctrine in Vatican II. Well, that was 7 years away, so that couldn't have been that. So the Marian visions, they seem to be, and there's videos of it, I think, and you see the girls walking around. In fact, the actual the prophecy regarding John Paul II, I believe, it wasn't John Paul II. They said that so many popes after this present pope. At the time, I think it was Pope Paul or Pope John, I can't remember. But that was broadcast live on Spanish television. That's how seriously people took it at the time. So yeah, that's an interesting one. The Marian vision, the Marian apparitions of Garabandal, very, very interesting one. That one. And that's what I know about it, and I think the girls were sincere. They saw something. The power of prophecy was proven, and the fact that they, for the rest of their lives, the 2 are still alive, but all 4 of them maintained, and I've seen them interviewed as adults on TV, came across as very sincere people, maintained this belief that they had encountered the Virgin Mary and the Archangel Michael. Well, I've no reason to doubt them. In terms of that they had an experience, what it really was, who knows. I just stopped then to go to get a cup of coffee and to talk about the third topic, and this one I've been meaning to talk about for a good long while in either Vaughan or in Hocus Focus, and it was on my radar because I got interested in it from day one, and then it's been slipping off my radar. And it was David from Newcastle who suggested I talk about the West Memphis tree. Now, the West Memphis tree story is colossal, and it's literally got everything. And it's also got a strange anomaly about it, in that its conspiracy theorists don't seem to have any interest in it when they very much should. It also tells us about the nature of conspiracy theorists, that they're really just born again Christians, and if they were real conspiracy theorists, they would actually take a look into what really happened, or what could have happened with the West Memphis Three. Now, I think it was summer 1993, in the city of West Memphis, which is in Arkansas, and it's just across the river from the famous Memphis, Tennessee, the home of rock and roll. But it's a very different place. It's one of the poorest places, West Memphis, in the United States. It's extremely conservative, Bible Belt, church-ridden, and it's that classic American Bible Belt town, in that you have this establishment who are all connected to these Pentecostal and Bible Belt pastor churches, and Southern Baptists and all that stuff. And then you have the other side, who are people what they call white trash or trailer trash. And the West Memphis Three story is as much about the class system as it is about anything else, but my God, does it have everything. So anyway, I remember watching a TV show in America at the time called A Current Affair, and they were talking about the satanic killing of 3 young boys in West Memphis, Arkansas. And I didn't follow the case in depth. I'll tell you why. It came at the tail end of what was called the Satanic Panic. Now, what the Satanic Panic was, if you don't know, was this absolutely appalling period of history where basically it started in the United States, in the Bible Belt, of course, and among police officers, lawyers, prosecutors, a belief grew out that there was a gigantic satanic conspiracy taking place in America that involved ritual sacrifice of babies, drinking blood, and the telltale symbols were everywhere, and that American parents should be vigilant of their own children, or children they know who may be involved in satanic activity. Now, satanic activity to them was playing Dungeons and Dragons, playing Hero Quest, listening to Judas Priest, listening to The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, Bauhaus, listening to electronic music, watching horror movies, reading horror paperback novels, taking an interest in the occult, tarot cards, anything, dressing in black. And these things became the ingredients in the madness of the Satanic Panic, because just having the aesthetic of what they called satanic cult behavior or membership was enough to put numerous families, people, and all innocent, every single one of them, in prison on incredible life sentences. And then it went over to England, where 2 lesbian social workers in Rochdale in Lancashire had found these police primers on satanic ritual abuse, all bullshit, all of them, written by crazy Christians, and started to believe that there was satanic ritual abuse going on in Rochdale and in the Greater Manchester area. They basically had a whole neighbourhood arrested of innocent people, and the target again was poor people, poor working class people. This is the thing which just defines the Satanic Panic in those days. It was basically a war against the working class. Then these 2 same lesbian social workers, rather than being chastised and pulled aside and being told, that you went too far, were then flown up to Shetland, above the north of Scotland, the Shetland Islands, and proceeded to do the same again to people up there. There are people in American prisons to this day who have been arrested and charged during the so-called Satanic Panic, and the evidence against them is absolutely ridiculous, and they're rotting away in prison. Now, this was why I have this about when, do you remember when the Hampstead hoax thing happened? And I had a huge revulsion against it. And all the truthers wanted to hang me up by a lamppost. Well, that's because I was seeing the same Nigel Nonce mania walking around and all this kind of thing. I was seeing, that's why I make fun of those types, because I saw firsthand the horrors of the evil and the wickedness of the satanic panics when they actually happened. You remember Judas Priest were being charged with murder because of a song on Sin After Sin where they said do it, and 2 kids high on drugs had killed themselves, and this crazy prosecutor had decided that Judas Priest had made the album to encourage kids to commit suicide while listening to their music. Now, this is nonsense, of course, and it was thrown out of court, but it should have never went into court. But the only reason it went into court was the Satanic Panic. The Satanic Panic also led to things like the PRMC, the Parents Music Council, led by Tipper Gore, who was Al Gore's wife, and they put the stickers on albums about parental guidance, and even on video games and board games even, about parental guidance. And that was politicians trying to, that Gore family, both him and his wife, pure sleaze. When the Satanic Panic was big, Tipper Gore decided to get some political points for her husband on that, just like what he did when the environmental thing got big. Just pure political sleaze. So, in the Satanic Panic was really during the late 80s. And by the early 90s it was petering out, and people were being released from prison, and a lot of cases were being struck off, or they were being rejected or thrown out of courts. But to this day some people are still in prison. This is why we must be very careful of these wild hysterias and stuff like that. So I know there are truthers watching this right now going, they're really all Satanists, because those types. But sane, intelligent, educated people. This is why I have such a very little time for truthers, because they remind me of these kind of people who got innocent people locked up during the Satanic Panic. So anyway, there's 2 aspects, 3 really, to the West Memphis 3. The first one is the actual crime itself. The second one is the prosecution of the 3 teenagers found guilty eventually for it. And finally, the lack of lessons learned and the conspiracy theory that I'm going to put out there, indulge, talk about, because there seems to be because people seem to be happy with just the satanic aspects, and I think there's a big cover-up going on here, which is why no one's ever been prosecuted. Now, it was August 1993, and 3 boys were found naked, bound, battered, mutilated, and dead. Some of them had been drowned in a creek while out cycling their bicycles. They're only little kids. They're like 9 or 10. Very young kids. It was horrible. And the town of West Memphis, quite rightly, was shocked and disgusted by the horrific murders of these little kids. Now, almost instantaneously, due to pressure on the police to solve the crime, and the police had terrible forensic evidence, the police were only too happy to indulge the satanic panickers in the community. So, with no evidence at all, other than we were at the tail end of the satanic panic in a Bible Belt area, the belief ran like wildfire through West Memphis that there was a satanic cult in the city, and it was killing young boys, and if we catch the cult, we'll catch the killers. Now, the police behaviour was shocking during the whole thing. The detectives, rather than doing cold, hard, police forensic work, conducting proper interviews, seeking leads, formally going through the motions, behaved more like witch-finder generals from the 1600s, early 1600s, late 1600s. They were quite happy to go along with the whole satanic ritual killing thing, because it took a lot of heat off them being unable to actually get evidence. And you see this over and over again with these satanic panic things. Law enforcement officials, social workers, school teachers deflect from their own incompetence by saying it's a classic, the devil made him do it, but projecting on someone else. So anyway, literally during this lynch mob phobia, 3 what they call trailer trash or white trash kids were arrested. One was called Charles Baldwin, there was another one called Jesse Miskelly, and the third one was called Damien Eccles, and he's an interesting character and we'll get to him later. So basically the police behaved as unprofessionally as you could imagine. They were not going to get evidence off these kids, they were going to railroad them and they were going to prosecute them. Now, they realised that one of them had severe learning disabilities. The kid called Jesse Miskelly. He had severe learning disabilities. And they knew this. And they knew that his family were extremely poor and the family weren't very bright. And he was going to be the silver bullet to get the prosecutions against the other 2 through his testimony. What they did was, I believe they went over to his trailer, his trailer home, where his parents lived, and they told him that there was a $45,000 reward if he told the police how Damien Nichols and Charles Baldwin had killed the 3 young boys. The police even discussed with his parents that day what kind of car they could buy with the money. This is how absurd it got. So they took, without his parents being present, the young lad Jesse Miskelly to the cell and interrogated him for 12 hours, and without, on his own. And this they knew and they basically gaslighted and groomed and got him to give this bizarre story that him, Damien Eccles and Charles Baldwin had killed these 3 little boys while worshipping the devil. And next thing you know, rather than getting the reward and getting his parents getting the car they thought they were going to buy with the money, all 3 of them are charged with first degree murder. 2 of them were 17 and 1 of them was 18, Damien Eccles. Now Damien Eccles was arrested for no other reason than he was a goth. He was, by 1993, the goth scene in America had moved out of the traditional bases of New York, Chicago, Detroit, LA, San Francisco, and had moved into the smaller communities. And Damien Eccles was interested in dark heavy metal, goth music. He dressed in black, and he was interested in the occult. He was interested in paganism, and he was interested in Wicca, and he was interested. He collected like Lovecraft books. He collected Dennis Wheatley books. That was me when I was that age, right? But lucky I grew up in the north side of Dublin. He grew up in the middle of the Bible, the most backward part of the Bible Belt. And one of the prosecutions used against him was his first name being Damien. His name being Damien because that was the name of the character in the Omen films, Damien. And people started to believe in West Memphis that Damien Eccles the Goth, who dressed in black, was the Antichrist, including his own school teachers, who said things like he looked like and must have been a satanic cult freak. Now, during this hysteria, all kinds of liars and fakes came out giving false testimonies. The locals were whipped up into a mass hysteria that they had captured the 3 core members of a goth heavy metal pagan satanic cult, witchcraft cult, and they were going to get them no matter what. Now, the 2 younger ones were, because they were under 18, Baldwin and Miss Kelly, were not going to face the death penalty. But Damien Eccles absolutely was, because he was 18. And people who were rational and stood back and said, those kids are not like that at all. Even Damien Eccles, he's just an eccentric teenager like you get in many towns and cities. Wasn't enough. People who didn't know them personally were convinced that all 3 were involved, and Eccles was Damien, the Antichrist ringleader of this group. So the court case went into fiasco when even the jury misconduct were actually going on about getting these devil worshippers and sending them straight to hell, this kind of thing. And the trial was an absolute fiasco. And when the verdicts was announced that Miss Kelly and Baldwin were going to get life in prison without parole, and especially, now the boys had to go to court wearing bulletproof vests because people wanted to kill them, based on no evidence, by the way. And Eccles was to get the death sentence. The behaviour of the law enforcement in West Memphis was disgusting. They were on TV going, the Lord has delivered the right verdict, I've never been happier, and all. And what was really sick about the whole thing, and it's another thing about it is the 3 little boys who had been found mutilated, drowned and beaten to death, hogtied as they call it, were kind of forgotten. And their parents were not properly able to grieve because the whole sensation of the trial was about Satanism and Damien, the Antichrist, living in West Memphis. And this was so the police showed no regard for the prosecutors and the local community. Again, other than the trailer trash who knew these 3 kids and knew they were not capable of these acts, were all jumping for joy. And there was the police going, Jesus has delivered the right verdict to West Memphis, and all this kind of thing. But as typical with these Christians, the actual suffering of the little boys and what their families had to go through was just completely forgotten. Now, that's a clue here to why I'm going to go to my little conspiracy part. You never hear conspiracies around this thing. So, the 3 lads went to prison, and almost immediately people from outside West Memphis and around the US said there's something really wrong with this case. It's very, very fishy. And celebrities from Johnny Depp to Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder, the Dixie Chicks band, and other people started to say these kids at least need a retrial. There's no evidence there. Eventually, they got out of prison, but they didn't get a retrial. They're still officially considered guilty, but they used some kind of technicality within the law to release them on provision that one day will get you. It's really weird, or something like that, or one day you'll be proven innocent. But they're not giving them a retrial. So they got out, and then the eye of suspicion started to turn on other people. The father of one of the boys that was murdered, they became suspicious of him. And there was some controversial DNA linked to him. There was also another individual that had been made a video of him shooting targets with pictures of the three boys, the three West Memphis, Satan worshipping boys, Eccles, Miss Kelly, and Baldwin, and going, "There's a bullet for you." And then they started to say that maybe he did it, and he was mocking the fact that three innocent kids had gotten down. I don't think he did it either, and there was all kinds of lawsuits and everything else involved. And so since that's happened, officially, unofficially, Baldwin, Miss Kelly, and Eccles are still considered guilty of the murders. But because of this plea bargain thing, Eccles and Baldwin said they never wanted to spend another second in prison, and they've actually remained friends to this day. There was other people who said things like they had seen them do this stuff, ritual stuff, and that was all thrown out of court when it found. One woman was famous for putting pictures of them up in a bar, getting drunk and throwing daggers at them, and then she claimed she'd seen these, which she recanted her testimony. And since then, I don't know what's happened to Jesse Miss Kelly, but I know Charles Baldwin has tried to get on with his life the best he could. Damien Eccles is an interesting character. And this is very similar to the story I was talking about when you asked me about my occult background. He said that both him and Charles Baldwin continued to practice the occult while in prison as a way of coping with the being locked up for the rest of their lives, or in case of Eccles, waiting for a death sentence, and knowing it would get them out, which it kind of did. And since then, Damien Eccles has written books on high magic, I think an autobiography of what he went through, and he's now an occultist. And it's just ironic how it's all turned out. Okay, so Damien Eccles to this day is quite a well-known occultist. A remarkable story. He survived. Jesse Miss Kelly was mentally retarded, basically. So he was innocent too, and the killers of the three young boys that were murdered in 1993 is still at large. Now, Damien, of course, because of the weird nature of their plea bargain, they can't really talk in depth about it. But Eccles said that the kids stumbled upon something that they weren't supposed to have seen. Okay. Now I'll bring the conspiratorial element into it. They may have seen something that they were not supposed to see. So we know these stories happen when people stumble upon marijuana, secret marijuana dens run by gangs or any kind of drug kind of thing. They'll kill them, and they'll leave a message. They'll torture and kill them to leave a message to anyone else not to look. Who were the power in Arkansas, but they created a culture of people like them and enablers, a gang culture, a criminal culture within Arkansas. And I remember a lot of drugs that would be brought into Memphis would have been trafficked through West Memphis across the Mississippi River into Tennessee in Memphis in Tennessee. So that's a possibility I think people should look into. Again, if you look on the internet and say, if you type in conspiracies in West Memphis Street, you don't really get much. You don't have three little boys murdered like that unless it's some kind of depraved psychopath, okay, a serial killer. But the thing was, no other murders happened like it. A serial killer would do it again. So there was something, I believe, to echo, Damien Eccles' statement was they saw something they weren't supposed to see, and they were silenced, and the nature of their murders was send a message out: don't send your kids around here again, or something like that. So that's the West Memphis Street story as it currently stands. They still haven't been exonerated. I think they accepted the plea bargain. Just about everybody even the parents of the kids, most of them accept that the three teenagers didn't kill their sons, and that's basically it. It's hanging wide open. But it's a story. I mean, it's a story that has everything, including this, from the satanic panic to survival. But I find it interesting that it was magic was what beat them in the end. These two boys, particularly Damien Eccles' interest in magic and the occult and paganism, is what made him survive and get out and start his life again. And it also helped Charles Baldwin, his friend, I believe. And it's an amazing story, but we must never forget too that 3 little boys were brutally murdered. And the sensation created around the satanic aspects of the case was probably very similar to Cyril Smith in Rochdale, that in order to deflect any investigation into him and Saville and their carry on, they charged innocent poor people with satanic ritual abuse. And that's why when the Hampstead hoax thing kicked off, I was livid. And until the day I die, I will always be very vigilant of this whole satanic panic thing coming back in any form, because it was an awful thing, and it attracts the wrong kinds of people. And if you're a conspiracy theorist, and which I am, I know that I have no problem admitting that, but I don't believe everything. You must always make sure you're not being manipulated. In that case, people were being manipulated, and the conspirator or conspirators who killed those 3 boys used the hysteria to get away and get free. There was also a character called Mr. Bojangles who was behaving strangely in a restaurant, and nothing ever came of that. Who was Mr. Bojangles? Again, I told you, the West Memphis Tree has everything. Throw your own impressions of it into the chat.